everybody. Welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. It's Francis here, and I've got writer extraordinaire Davis Winkie from Army Times and military publications beyond here with us. Davis, how are you doing today?
I am doing all right. Trying to come to terms with the news that this massive document leak might have been from an air guard part timer in Massachusetts.
I just saw that before you jumped on here. I opened up the Washington Post article that's just like some dumbass airman who was trying to win internet points in a Discord server by doing racism and showing off top secret stuff. Phenomenal.
Yeah,
I
and
love
this
it.
is this is all going to be horribly dated probably by the time anybody hears this. But my favorite part of the first round of stories that have named this guy is the part where anonymous law enforcement officials are like, "Yeah, we just want to talk to this guy." Like, "Oh yeah, I bet they do."
I saw a tweet somewhere where somebody said, "Hey, don't make jokes online about 3D printing guns and giving it to the homeless unless you want the FBI to show up at your door." And then, had to follow that up with, unfortunate. My wife's a real trooper, having to identify herself as the wife of Bongwater Sun Tea. So, we all online will destroy all of us at some point. It's just how long and when. Like, when's going to be the first time that like you type something and you hit tweet and you don't go back and delete it? Like, I've done that a few times. I've been like, you know what? Maybe saying that I too would have a garden with statues of random historical figures, some of them who may be dictators, is kind of a dream for me. But like cool ones like Napoleon, not the weird one. Only 200 years older and beyond. We're talking Genghis Khans and Julius Caesars, not Mussolini. Ugh, don't want that. Unless my Mussolini statue is hung upside down in the garden. That's fine.
So you're telling me you wouldn't display a Pol Pot chia?
I think that maybe the only way that you can make it okay is if you show the dictators in their repose of death. Like the Mussolini one has to be hanging upside down. The Gaddafi one has to be beaten and stabbed in the ass to death. Just really like, yes, it's my garden of dead dictators. Adolf Hitler just with just laying somewhere with a friggin' hole in his head and a sunflower growing out of it.
Yeah. Million
really
dollar idea for any billionaires listening.
Yeah, if you're going to be a billionaire and have weird collections of shit, at least make it like not problematic. I don't go to big gun shows anymore because there's too many people selling Nazi paraphernalia. So like, I find it pretty easy to stay away from it. I don't know how these billionaires don't, but I don't know. They're weird. Who knows? Billionaires all loved Adolf Hitler when he was alive. They all love him when he's dead now too. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the weird shit that I would do with too much money. We're here to talk about the Army. Once again, the Army. Well, I don't want to say once again because this has been a long time coming, and this has been kind of a known issue. The headline is "How the Army Quietly Discharges Soldiers Charged with Violent Crimes." And Davis, you're on here as the writer, but we also have Bianna Davila, Lexi Churchill, and Bren Larson as well. And I know that this feels. I guess let me ask you: how did this story? First off, how did it come together?
Absolutely. So this story in particular came together through an interesting process. So this joint Texas Tribune ProPublica investigative unit of Vianna, Lexi, and Ren had started looking into Army military justice in the wake of Vanessa Guillen's death and kind of the uproar that came out of that. It's a natural fit for a team like theirs. They've got a lot of investigative firepower. They've got a lot of data expertise. And the Army has a really big presence in Texas. And in August of 2022, their first story from a court-martial database that they'd obtained came out, and it looked at systemic disparities in pretrial confinement rates. For the uninitiated among our listeners, pretrial confinement is basically like being locked up without bail before your trial, except it differs in some important ways. You can't get out of pretrial confinement once it's awarded because there is no bail in the military. but it's also simultaneously a high bar for commanders to meet. You have to really dislike somebody to get them confined before trial. And what they had found in their story that was done without me was that pretrial confinement is used at a higher rate at most posts for things like drug offenses, disrespecting commanders, etc., than things like sexual assault. We don't need to get into like the systemic reasons for that, but like they had this wonderful data set that had powered that. And I, at the same time, had been working to build a data set of my own of court martial results the same week that their story came out. I read their story, I scream. I immediately start emailing these people with whom I was already kind of tangentially connected through my work on the border missions with the Texas Tribune and pitched them on collaborating. And that's how the 8-month reporting process on administrative separations in lieu of trial started.
So, well, I guess, and you mentioned that the pretrial confinement is, of course, it's used more when you're pissing off the commander versus when you're pissing off somebody else. And so, how did you get involved into it?
Yeah, I wasn't involved on their first pretrial confinement story, but I had done some previous work in that lane and immediately saw like the power of the data and other things they had. And the administrative separation story, the one about quietly discharging soldiers charged with violent crimes, came about from them looking at the same data they used for the pretrial confinement story. They had this master data set they'd gotten from the Army that has the outcomes of every single court martial that has made it to arraignment since 1989, in fact. And what they found was that some of these cases were marked as having ended in administrative separation in lieu of trial. The charges were dismissed, and the soldier had gone on with their life. And they decided that they wanted to look into that. And when I joined the team, I kind of brought this background and expertise in Army administrative regulations. I brought contacts in the Army, sources, inside knowledge of how to beat information out of Army public affairs, for lack of a better way to put it. And we were able to combine that into a story where I think we've really shone a light on this practice that's been unfolding under our noses for several decades now.
Yeah, I want to highlight as well, because recently, if you remember back to 2017, the shooting at the First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs, where a guy walked in, killed people in church. The Air Force was ordered to pay $230 million to the survivors because they were found to be mostly at fault for knowing that this guy had problems, knowing that he had he had previous assault convictions, and they were not given to the FBI. So the thing, and I know that nothing, you and I both know, and anybody who's been in the Army knows, nothing moves quickly in the Army. But that sets a precedence. That is now saying, if you're not doing this correctly, people can sue you for it. So your first examples, the first examples in the story were two people who were arrested for assault. Going on domestic assault, going on to do assault later on, because they're not being tracked by anybody. They're not being put into a system that says, "Hey, this guy did a federal offense. Don't let him own guns. Don't let him. He's not allowed to do this, that, or the other thing, because we know it and we track it and we know what's going on." Now we see the Air Force having to pay a bunch of money because they did not report this information to the FBI. They're not reporting. They're letting these people go. And I don't know, maybe this one's a little bit different because maybe the Air Force had already convicted this guy, because it seems the Army doesn't even go to that point. It's just this seems like it's going to be too much work. What's going to be the easiest thing? Bounce him out and let somebody else deal with him. So there could be a difference there. The difference between somebody who is convicted, we know that there's a problem, or the Army just being like, I don't know. I mean, we were told he beat his wife, but we just got him out. So we don't know. He has a presumption of innocence. So it's not technically our fault that he went out and, beat his girlfriend, 3 days after he got out of the military.
Yeah, and let me lay out the process of these separations a little bit to help set the stage for why they're so hard to track. So when a soldier has done crime, they get investigated, and the criminal investigating agency, whether it's the military police, whether it's the Army Criminal Investigation Division, whether it's perhaps a civilian law enforcement agency, will present a case to the soldiers' commanders. And the commanders will decide whether to prefer criminal charges against this soldier. And then the higher level headquarters will decide whether to refer those charges and put them on course for court martial. And then after that, somebody is arraigned. Typically, they have another hearing, and then they'll go to trial. But these administrative separations in lieu of trial actually represent an off ramp to get people out along that pipeline. So once somebody is facing charges that could lead to them getting a punitive discharge as their sentence if it went to trial, or in the case of officers, being dismissed from the service, which is like the officer version of a dishonorable discharge, you can request a discharge in lieu of trial, or a resignation for the good of the service is actually the old name for it, where basically you are agreeing that if the commander overseeing the trial dismisses all of your charges, you are willing to leave the military, waive your right to a separation board hearing, and in 99% of cases, roughly speaking, you're going to get what's called an other than honorable discharge, where you lose some VA benefits. You can't collect a pension for disability. You can't collect education benefits. It's basically saying, hey, take this chunk of flesh out of me. Let me go. This case will be off your hands. And, I will be lightly punished as I go into civilian life. And there's incentives on both sides for these things, man. Like, imagine if you're accused of crime, you've either actually done crime or you think you're going to get convicted of crime. This sounds like a pretty good deal, doesn't it? You don't have a criminal record on the other side. You lose some benefits, but you don't have to lose your freedom. You don't have to, lose money. Like, you can get ordered to pay fines as part of your conviction. It's a pretty good deal if you think you've actually done crime or at serious risk of being convicted for it. And then on the prosecution side, if you have a case that you don't think you can win at trial, but you've got a defendant who's scared enough, you could be like, hint, hint, wink, wink. If you request one of these handy little discharges, I think it just might go through. And it's seen as a way to offload cases that might not win, cases that might take too much time and resources to prosecute, whether it's because of issues with the evidence, shitty investigative quality by your law enforcement people, or something like that. They see it as a way to manage workload and offload bad cases while also, air quote, punishing the defendant a little bit, so to speak.
Yeah, you're punished by you don't have to wake up for PT anymore.
Yeah, but because this is an administrative process that dismisses your charges, there is no conviction to send to these databases that would allow for a background check to keep you from buying a weapon. In the case of that Air Force guy, he was convicted of a crime of domestic violence. He should have been able to buy a weapon. The Air Force failed to enter his name into an FBI database that would have popped in a background check for that. Therefore, they are liable. In this case, the military's, in the case of administrative separations, the military's bases are covered, man. The Privacy Act prevents them from really disclosing details about these cases publicly because they ended in a discharge rather than a conviction. And the military treats acquittals and dismissals as things that are wiped from the public record. They will take down the listing of the trial. They will deny requests for documents in most cases. And one of the effects of getting one of these kinds of discharges is just like everything being shoved down the memory hole. So there's not even like the prospect of like liability of people suing the military for these guys going on to do more crime or something like that. And then also, for the people who got bullied into accepting these on like weak cases or for minor crimes, they face a really uphill battle to try to get their discharges upgraded and try to get their benefits restored. The overarching theme that we found is, if you look back at the resignation for the good of the service term, the service, the Army, is the only party whose needs are consistently being served by these discharges.
Yeah, that is that is the real thorn on this one, is that the only person who benefits is the Army and the person who did crime. Nobody else benefits from this. The civilian population, the victims, nobody is going to benefit from this guy just leaving the military. So why do we have this? What is this? What is this like? Sign this paper and you'll get out. Why do we even have something like this, like as a backdoor loophole in the military?
Yeah, so the roots of this go back to the 1950s and 60s when you see this comprehensive overhaul of military justice and you see the creation of various ways for people to leave the military, in a manner other than, serving your contract, retiring, or, getting convicted or dying. Like if those are the only ways to get out, you're going to have a lot of administrative bottlenecks. And so you see like a lot of various administrative separation paths get established during that era, for various things. Like today, if you are somebody who doesn't have an adequate way to make sure that your kids are taken care of in the event that you're deployed, you can actually get discharged from the military for that.
And though for something like that, I would imagine you're not getting an other than honorable.
Exactly. So there's a lot of different kinds of administrative separations. And the deeper backstory that some experts told us is that for officers, there's kind of always been the option to have a well-timed resignation request. Like if you're about to get rung up on some charges. And often, like, this practice would arise like when people were being investigated for criminalized homosexuality, which was illegal in the military for a very long time. And so officers were often granted the opportunity to resign with air quote honor in lieu of being investigated and taken to court martial. And on the enlisted side, these were actually first established as a fairness thing. Like, hey, officers have this option. The troops should have it too. They should be able to, like, offer to leave instead of going to trial. And that's how this started.
Of all the things that officers have and enlisted people don't, they went with, we want a faster way to get the fuck out of here rather than give us more money, maybe.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, to be clear, it was an officer who came up with the idea that this would be a fairness thing. So,
well, yeah, again, like nobody consulted the enlisted pukes. So
no, nobody did. And what actually ended up happening into the 60s and as we get into the Vietnam War is a lot of people were being thrown out under these authorities for going AWOL, because you had so many people who were drafted, deserting and, dodging the draft and running away after they get to training and stuff. And the military justice system just did not have the resources to take all of these people to trial. And so these authorities to let people leave before trial at their own request, and you slap them on the wrist with an other than honorable discharge, like that actually became a really useful way to meter your workload if you're the Army's lawyers.
I've read enough anti-war Vietnam zines to know that like it would probably be a lot easier to be like, hey, instead of like chucking a wrench into the ship engine and scuttling it for 6 months, do you just want to go home? And we'll keep all the guys who like we can kind of like malleable, we can beat him into shape, we can go let him get all screwed up in Vietnam and bring him home after a year. But like you're like actively destroying stuff. Can you please go away?
Yeah. And it's actually in the wake of this, like explosion in the use of discharges in lieu of trial that the Government Accountability Office, or its predecessor org, which is like a federal government watchdog agency, comes down in 1978 and says, hey, eliminate these discharges. There are due process issues. There are issues with, a handful of people charged with serious crimes getting to skate because of them. Like, these just need to go away entirely. And Francis, you want to guess what the Pentagon did with that recommendation? Non-binding recommendation.
I don't believe they had automatic shredders back then, so I assume balled up and thrown into a wastebasket somewhere.
Yes. And there were a lot of pages to the report. So, like, by the end of like each individual ball being tossed into their trash can, the guy probably had his free throw form down pat.
Yeah, and I don't want to like take away from like administrative separation is not necessarily a bad thing. There were people like when I went through basic training, there were people in the middle of basic training who are just like, yeah, I fucked up. I don't want to do this anymore. And they will be admitted. They were like, okay, we'll let you go. Maybe you get a slap on the wrist. Maybe it's not going to work out great for you in the long run. But if you don't want to be here, we don't want you here. And to be fair, I went through basic before 9/11, so it was very, very much still the Clinton army, very shrunk down and everything. So the idea of like being able to administratively separate somebody, again, like you said, for hardships, I don't have anybody to take care of my family, I'm sole caretaker, things like that. Those are all like good reasons to have.
Yeah.
And
I've got a good one too. There's this country music star, Zach Bryan, who was a non-commissioned officer in the Navy, who was just making country music on YouTube and self-releasing albums on Spotify until like a year and a half ago, I want to say. He absolutely blew up and got signed to a massive record deal and got signed, like dangled millions of dollars to go on tour. And he turned to the Navy and just kind of was like, hey guys, like I really love the Navy, but should I go? And the Navy was like, hey, we can let this guy who's becoming a megastar leave on good terms early, give him an honorable discharge, and he's going to go out and be like, yeah, I loved my 8 years in the Navy. I had a good time in the Navy. I saw the world. And, when a bigger opportunity came up, they let me go. And,
And I imagine the same thing kind of goes for if, Private Jones goes and buys a scratcher and wins $10 million. The Army is going to be like, all right, Private, you have $10 million and we understand there's nothing that we can do. Like, unless Private Jones is just like, no, I really want to stay. I really love the Army. I love being yelled at. I love, waking up at 6 a.m. and not getting off work until, fucking 12 hours later. That is all dice to me. I'm sure they'll let you stay, but also, if you've got more money than the Navy or the Army will ever give you in life, I just like, yeah, go, please. Like it's going to be a lot easier for everybody if you're not here, especially if you don't want to be here anymore. Like the Navy's not going to, like, if it was a draft kind of situation, sure. But like in this, like this guy isn't, it's like, look, fuck you guys. I'm going to go on tour. I'm blowing up. I'm not going to let the Navy step on that. So it's good that the Navy has the ability to do that. It's good the Army has the ability to do that. But much like any good thing that the military has, it gets horribly abused in ways that it shouldn't be. Because not only did nobody like, it's not so much that nobody thought like we should write a process in here that says, you can do administrative discharges for X, Y, and Z, but not for this. Do not just kick people out because you don't want to deal with prosecuting them for violent crimes. But eventually you do have to write that in because people are going to say, well, it doesn't say I can't do this.
Well, it actually does for certain other authorities. So I'm about to speak Army HR. There's certain kinds of administrative separations that are called like a 1412 Bravo and 1412 Charlie based on like their specific citation in the regulation that oversees these things. And like those kinds of separations aren't like tied to trial the same way that the ones that my colleagues and I wrote about are. And those 1412 chapter discharges specifically say you cannot do this in lieu of punishing somebody for something they've done.
Well, well, look at that.
Well, and so like it's important to keep in mind that like the story we wrote and the 1978 report that I was just discussing were laser focused on the process of doing this for people who have been charged with crimes by the military and are on track to go to trial. And here's the thing about this, man, is it's the law of unintended consequences. When something stays in place like this over the course of several decades, its use is going to evolve based on like the evolving needs of the military, based on the changing resources and demands on the military justice system, based on like people every now and then finding new creative ways to use it. Like one example is I want to say in 2011 at Fort Carson, Dave Phillips, now of the New York Times, reported out an investigative story where a lawyer there basically emailed all of his subordinates and said, hey, these discharges in lieu of trial mean that they're not going to be eligible for VA benefits. So if you have anybody who is on track for a med board and is going to get kicked out for medical reasons, you could save the Army a lot of time and money if there's an appropriate reason to discharge them in lieu of trial. And so what Dave Phillips did was he dug up a bunch of anecdotes of people who had been like wounded in combat who were brought up on minor charges that could have been dealt with by other means, just so that they could be railroaded into requesting one of these kinds of discharges.
Which, and that doesn't make sense to me to have somebody say you can save the Army money, because it's not like, oh, we saved the Army money and now I get to use that money. It never works that way. Like, you fucking over somebody else financially in the Army does not come back around and be like, oh, this colonel did really well, we're going to give him a raise, because that doesn't exist. You don't just get a raise as an individual person. You get more money because we all do, or you get more money because you go up in rank or time in grade or time in service. But like, all of the money that you make in the military is based on how long you've sat in a position, not by actually what you do or how good you are at your job. So like, the entire idea of, what would be a lot of fun is to fuck over these soldiers, to have some sort of nebulous, positivity for, I don't know, a general is going to feel happy. Like, still, you're not going to get any money for it. Like, so I don't understand the direct to do something like that unless other threats came with it, which I'm sure did.
And in situations like that, like to put on my company man hat as a former Army HR officer myself, the company line on something like this is, if somebody is going through a lengthy medical evaluation board process, might end up getting kicked out anyways. If they're being, a problem and harming good order and discipline, whether it's because they bonked their head or got their brain rattled by an explosion or not, like they are still taking up a spot in my unit that can be filled by somebody else who's more productive, and potentially bringing down those around them. And the problem is that a lot of people throughout the Army have seen these kinds of discharges as tools for the good of the service, for their convenience, in order to, move on problem soldiers, or as the process has evolved now, increasingly in cases where soldiers are charged with violent crimes, but the evidence might not be there to support a conviction, they're using it to just push that person out of the Army and be like, all right, well, our problem is solved because this guy's not in our formation anymore. And we feel like we got something out of it by taking away those benefits.
Yeah, and I imagine it just makes it a lot easier too. Like, it's a lot easier to sign this paperwork than it is to go through the whole med board process and everything. But of course, on this podcast, we were never surprised that the Army fucks over soldiers, considering that there's one thing the Army's really good at, and that's fucking over soldiers. Everything else is kind of a tangential, like, we're kind of good at it by accident sometimes. We wrote down a lot of doctrine, but man, like, on the fly, like, our without having to write anything down, fucking over a soldier is just goddamn. It's what the Army does so well.
It, sometimes it can feel like that.
So do we have any forward momentum on this, like to stop doing this? Or is this still just kind of this happens, fuck off,
like,
we're going to do it?
I am sure that there are cases where a discharge like this can seem like the least bad option from a justice perspective. Because, say, a judge rules that somebody's confession can't be admitted in court, and you're now going to lose that case. And in this kind of situation, like, hey, you're still getting some kind of punishment and getting somebody out. Like, there's situations in which these things make sense, but on the other hand, what happens if that happens out in the civilian world? The charges get dropped, and there aren't these lifelong consequences for it. There's a due process concern, and there's also hey, are people going to go on to do worse things because this was the easy button instead of like finding a way to get to a plea deal or convict them on a lesser charge or something like that? It's a very alluring option.
And what you said, it does about civilian court as well. That does like assault, sexual assault especially, is very hard to convict in the civilian world. It's not any easier to convict in the military world. Now, when there's very obvious like physical evidence, obviously you should pursue something like that. But again, it's the question becomes, okay, we have this person being charged with this, but we don't have can't use one person's testimony. We don't have any physical evidence. What's the correct answer? Do we let them loose into the civilian world or let them loose back into the Army world?
And that's pretty much like the argument that Army officials gave us as they worked with us over the course of this investigation. And it all makes sense in a very Army way. But from somebody on the outside looking in who has never been immersed in this stuff as much as you and I have, Francis, it probably looks kind of crazy. And so
I think the big thing is that like you and I know that situations like what I just described exist and that there's no good answer to it. But also there are going to be cases where it's like that was a fucking slam dunk and you let them out because you're lazy. Like if these processes get used as the way that they're supposed to be used in some kind of a standardized process of if we don't have this, then we can move forward in this way. But if we do have X, Y, and Z, then we're going to go ahead and go for court-martial conviction on our end or whatever. But there's not that, and of course, all of these things vary command to command. There's never a standardized placement of here's what you do in these situations. Here's your process. Like my job, I have process documents. I follow the process documents because that's what you do to do the thing, and that's how we know what to do because we wrote it down. And the Army's great at writing stuff down about things that it wants you to do by the numbers. But then there's things like this where it's just like, look, we have this thing. Here's how you're supposed to use it. We're not going to check up on it though. And that's where it comes. The idea that we know, Davis, it's going to be abused. We know it is abused. We know it will continue to be abused. And we know that there's people out there who are, commanders who are lazy, who just don't want to go through with stuff. We know, Ron DeSantis has shown us that JAG officers can be the biggest pieces of shit in the entire world, especially in the entire military. Like, imagine a troop and a lawyer. Holy shit. The only thing worse is a troop and a cop. And we have plenty of those, but they're all enlisted. We got to deal with them. Well, I got to deal with them.
What I'll add to this here is that a lot of the problems that we've laid out here about like cases at the margins where an authority that can be used for good can also be used to enable laziness or to just railroad people could be solved by having a public record of these things, which would enable for scrutiny by media, would enable, scrutiny by watchdog agencies, would just allow for more insurance that these are going to be used judiciously, effectively, and, without doing undue harm to people. And as for where they stand now and where they might go next, right now the military justice system is in the middle of its most significant reforms since perhaps the 1950s. The issue of commanders failing to properly handle major crimes cases, such as the Vanessa Guillen affair at Fort Hood, inspired Congress to create what's called the Office of Special Trial Counsel for each branch, which is going to be delegated exclusive authority to handle certain kinds of crimes, ranging from murder all the way down to like sexual harassment, sexual assault, manslaughter. I have a list somewhere. I might have even listed them in like a news roundup we did like 4 or 5 months ago, if I remember right. And we don't know yet, though, how these discharges are going to fit into that system, because it's already clear that the special trial counsel for each service will have the exclusive authority to bring or dismiss charges on these covered kinds of crimes. But the administrative action of discharging somebody has always been with the commanders, with the chain of command. Like, what are you going to do when it's the general overseeing the trial, technically, who absolutely does not want to see this service member of theirs, dismiss or, like discharged from the service, or absolutely wants them discharged, but the special trial counsel doesn't want to see them dismissed. And we couldn't get hard answers on this yet from the Army or from the Pentagon, because these policies are still being written, which means, we're hopeful that our story can help inform lawmakers, policymakers, and, senior officials within the services to understand the edge cases and the historic use of these authorities that might need to be accounted for in whatever form they're going to exist moving forward under these new reforms.
Yeah, I'll to cap this off, I'll kind of bring up. I don't. It didn't really. It wasn't the same as this, in particular kind of situation where somebody was about to be convicted of a crime and they were allowed to they were allowed to sign a piece of paper. But I did know a guy in my old unit years and years ago who popped hot on a urine test, and the commander luckily was like related to him, far enough away that that it wasn't like a complete one-on-one, but close enough that there was some familial bonds there. And the captain's like, "Look, I'm gonna go talk to command staff, and I'm going to say you're a good soldier. You got all this, good time. You have combat experience, as in the infantry. You've been overseas. You've done this, that, and the other thing. You made a mistake. Your enlistment is up, and I'm going to tell them that you're okay with not reenlisting if they give you the honorable discharge." And he's just like, "Yep, yep, I will do all of those things." And they gave it to him, which is, I mean, getting busted for smoking weed is dumb, but I was impressed that they, yeah, like I said, it's not the same. It was kind of instead of going through all of this, what if he just got out of the army because his contract's up? That way, nobody has to do anything. His contract was up in like 4 months or so. He's like, he just shows up for drill. Unless you don't want him to show up to drill either. They're like, no, show up to drill, do that stuff. But once he's done, he's done. He's not going to reenlist. He's going to move on. And none of us are going to talk about this ever again. Which, like, knowing now, should have gone back to him and be like, hey, in like a year and a half, you can re-enlist, right? Because like none of this shit's going to be on your record. It's just going to be like, you got out and you can get back in. As far as I know, he did not, and I don't blame him. Probably because smoking weed is way better than being in the army, which I can attest to. Davis, I got one more thing I want us to talk about. An article that you did after going to the AUSA in Huntsville, Alabama this year recently. Javelin Hero. We have how a video game engine will power javelin anti-tank training. So, and we have this great picture of somebody with like a a um, a fake javelin that has all, I imagine, all kinds of training, doodads on the inside of it. But like it's basically, I mean, it's Guitar Hero, or Rock Band. We all, if you're old enough to remember those games when we all bought the peripherals and we all got together and we hit colored buttons together for roughly a year and a half, and then it all went away. I'm not too sure why. But now we have a peripheral that is just a fucked up weapon of war. So what's going on here? It looks like they're basing this off of Fortnite, which
Yeah.
it says Fortnite, but that's just it's just on the Unreal Engine, right?
Yeah. Basically, what's going on here is the Javelin anti-tank missile system has been around for a while, and the idea of having a classroom simulator trainer for it isn't new. There's a version that's been around for, I want to say, almost 2 decades now. And what this particular contractor is doing with it is drawing on Epic Games' Unreal Engine to create a way more realistic world in which you're trying to blow up simulated tanks on this classroom simulator. And Francis, I'm going to be real with you, man. Like I got to like shoot this simulator at fake T-72s, and it seemed like a useful tool for familiarizing me with the buttons and knobs and various things that are on one of these obscenely expensive anti-tank missiles. And the main difference that I think soldiers are going to notice with this is like on the current version of the trainer, man, like everything looks like potato. Like it's you can barely tell that the targets are like vehicles. They're very poorly rendered. It looks like
Well, I was gonna say, look, Dave, I've watched plenty of footage out of Ukraine of tanks getting blown up with javelins, and even those screens are also kind of garbage. So
it's
what?
worse than those, man. I promise you, because that I got to see like they let me do a side by side comparison of the two. Like they were able to switch between like the different software powering it. And the original one, while it still serves the purpose of familiarizing you with all the doodads on the weapons system, you're not going to get the same buy-in out of the Gen Z kids who are trying to train on it if they feel like they're, using this simulator on like an Atari.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as far as their video gaming experiences go. But I really think that this America's Army was a game that the Army put out that nobody wanted to play because things like Arma 3 were way better and did what America's Army was trying to do. But like this, I feel like could be a really great, like, if not trainer, at least like a game mode, what called like Tank Hunter or something, where you've got you've got one side is like five guys in a tank, or I don't know how many people fit in a tank, three guys in a tank, whatever. However many you can cram inside of a T-72, and then like four infantry, and then you've got a hunter squad of like four guys, one with a javelin, who's trying to take him down. I'm just saying, video game makers, get at me with that idea. We can kind of flesh it out, because this is perfect. Now you've got a whole javelin system that your buddy can throw up on his shoulder. The guy who has the gamer chair and has the glowing water cooled computer tower because he makes so much money and has no idea what to do with it. Those guys that have the full yoke and stick and rudder and yaw setups for the Microsoft flight simulators. That's the guy who's buying a javelin to go play Call of Duty 17 or whatever and go blow up people in Atropia over there. So
Well, for Francis, I'm not trying to be like an advertisement here or anything, but if the Army hits its tech development goals that it's working on right now, people could have that for a small price of a set number of years of their lives. So the service is working to develop what it's calling like its simulated training environment or synthetic training environment, where they are trying to create like a unified virtual world where entire like units and like up to the battalion level can train in the same simulated space on like their real weapon systems, like onboard simulators in your tank and your javelin or your striker vehicle sitting out in the motor pool while while you're like ripping it in some virtual terrain. And you've got an infantry squad that's in some simulator elsewhere that's like maneuvering with your tank unit as well, like doing like actual simulated combined arms maneuver to include like force on force kind of stuff. Like that's the kind of training future that the Army is trying to build towards. And peripherals that are purpose built, like this Javelin simulator and the software powering it, those are the kinds of things that their goal over the next couple of decades is to integrate them all into a joint training environment where, without leaving your unit's buildings, or without leaving posts, you can get some of the effect of real world training, as opposed to potato.
I'm going to say, I know that there's some 11 bang bangs out there who are getting really excited about this, but no, you're still going to the box, put on your 40 pounds of bullshit and go walk around in the desert.
Because, for sure. Like I asked,
the tankers, like, yeah, look at us. We're in our tanks. We're driving around. You got everybody else who drives around, like the infantry is like, no, get out there and fucking walk.
Yeah, so I actually asked a general about this because planning for those kinds of field exercises where people actually like get dirt on their boots and stuff, like and executing those exercises is a big quality of life concern, where like a ton of planning time and time away from your family and other things needs to go into it. I was like, hey, like if you're able to do like large scale collective simulated training, does that like reduce this big real world training workload or anything like that? They're like, nah, it's not going to replace any of it. You still got to go do it in real life. I was like,
good.
Okay.
Good. This is
and,
one thing.
Also keep the timelines in mind. If any of those 11 bang bangs are listening to us right now, by the time this stuff is fielded, your knees and back aren't going to work anymore anyways, probably, which means that the simulator might be your only option.
No, Davis, we're going to get them those exoskeleton legs that have been in development since I joined the Army 20 plus years ago. Just got to turn another corner, Davis. We just got to turn the corner and then we'll be there.
Always one away.
Davis, thank you so much for coming on. Tell people where they can find you.
You can find me on armytimes.com. I'm also on the Cursed Bird website at Davis_Winkie, where you can find occasional links to my stories and really low quality musings on the universe.
Yeah, don't worry. We're all posters. So we have the things that we advertise, and then we have the dumb bullshit that's in our head that we spew out. So,
well, as somebody who was a listener before I was ever a caller, I think like the posting spirit is in my heart.
The important part is that we're having fun. Davis, thank you for coming on. Everybody, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, man. Take care.